Imagine that each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing that you're happy even while dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. For more support, check out the Grief and Happiness Handbook and cards. I welcome you to listen to this podcast and discover endless possibilities for your life. Aloha, welcome to my podcast for today. I have a wonderful guest, Dr. Natasha Trujillo. She's done some amazing work, and I am just so excited to get to talk to her. So welcome, Tasha. How are you?
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm just great. Can you tell our listeners about you?
Absolutely. I am a counseling and sports psychologist by trade and now an author. So just wrote my first book. Clinically, I specialize in a few different things, grief and loss being one of the primary ones, but also eating disorders, trauma, perfectionism, and performance psychology. And I work particularly with athletes, so mostly college, professional, and Olympic and Paralympic athletes, either current or former or retired.
That just sounds like such an interesting specialization. I like that a lot. Seems like athletes have a whole different set of challenges than just regular people who aren't in competition like that.
Yeah, I mean, the performance piece, right? The life of a college or professional athlete is very different than jobs you and I have, because oftentimes we don't have millions of people sitting in watching our conversations and watching how we do what we do. So there's definitely some external pressures and just different challenges that they face. But I also always love to emphasize that they're people first. So their mental health and some of what they go through is no different than any other person. And so I really like to be able to bring that balance and work on mental health things with them. And then, of course, help them get their edge up in their sport and their performance domain too.
That just sounds great. I was a swimmer in high school, competed on the local swim team, and I did diving in high school. And it's a whole different set of things when you step in as an athlete as opposed to an observer, which most people are.
Yes, and I always say once an athlete, always an athlete. I'm a former athlete too, and you can't knock out some of those patterns and some of that mindset, and it definitely carries you into all the other arenas throughout life.
Yeah, wow. Well, I want to talk about your book. I was just amazed by it. I've taught writing at the university level for many years, and I've written, I think, 6 books now. And I love writing, and I loved the way you wrote your book. The research was incredible, and it's the kind of research that I think would be good for people to do with their families anyway, whether they're going to write it or not. It was so beautiful and so deep and so detailed about the relationships with the person that was the focus of each chapter, and it was a different person for each chapter. So tell me about the experience of writing that book.
Oh my goodness, there's a lot of layers to it. So it really was profound in so many ways to ask the people who have impacted me the most to sit down with me and talk with me one-on-one about oftentimes things that they've tried to avoid, right? Or forget or deny or reject for decades, and saying, hey, can we talk about this? Can we air all the dirty laundry? Can we get everything on the table? Was really quite profound in many ways. Everyone in my family and my life was very on board with it and very supportive. And I have to thank them, right? Because the book wouldn't have become what it became without their willingness and their support and their ability to agree to engage with the process.
It was just wide open. It seemed like nothing was untouchable in the conversations. When I was reading it, I kept thinking, oh, I wish I would have talked to my family this way, when I could still. My parents were very quiet about their lives. I don't know exactly why. I have presume some things, but I could be totally off base because they just never talked about it. And I really wanted to know, but I didn't ask them because we just didn't talk about things, any personal things, didn't share things. And the sharing in your family story was incredible. The detail was just fantastic. I felt like I knew each member of your family that you were writing about. What were some experiences you had in the process of doing that really stood out for you?
So my approach is I kind of figured out what event I wanted to write about. And when I was deciding, I knew that the book was going to be 12 chapters because 12 is my favorite number. And then from there, I was kind of like, what experiences have impacted me the most? At least at that point in time in my life, when I was getting ready to write the book, I was struggling with my own grief. And I was like, what is going on, right? What are some of the ideas, or who are some of the people that have contributed to who I am right now, and why I am the way I am, why my family are the way they are, etc. Once I kind of had the events picked, I got those key players who played a role in that story, and I wanted to interview all of them one-on-one, because what I didn't want was people talking over each other or even disagreeing. Like, I really wanted each person to be able to tell me their story unfiltered. And I recorded all of those interviews. And then when I went through and was listening, I was able to kind of craft the narrative and piece together what was the same and what was different. And so that was kind of a unique dynamic too, as if something was different, who is right? Or are they both right? Or are they both wrong? And how do I craft that? And how do I make that come through in the writing? So sometimes there were follow-up conversations, and sometimes quite hard conversations, saying, hey, I don't think I quite got everything I needed to here, or did you give me some different information? And always coming back to these conversations about respect too, because that was a big thing for me. I wanted to make sure that it was done tastefully and that everyone involved understands what was written and is okay with what is written and agrees with it as being as accurate as possible. So there were definitely layers of conversation over time as I was writing it.
Wow. The experiences that you talk about are profound, really. Each one of them, I feel like I know your family now. It was just beautiful. I think a lot of times we don't know how to have those conversations or how to start them, or though I love you wrote your book and I love to write, not everybody likes to write, but they still can get that information. And the fact that you recorded it, that's neat, because you can have their voice even when they're not here in physical form.
That was definitely something that I thought about along the way. And just this idea of making the untalkable talkable, right? When I was done with the book, I was kind of like, okay, so how can people benefit, right? Why should they read my book? Why is this an important piece to actually take to the next level? Because I definitely had those moments where I was like, wow, this is so vulnerable. Maybe this is just for me. Maybe this has just been one long journal entry. But then I was like, no, I really think there's things in here that can be useful for others. And I think one of the primary pieces was making the untalkable talkable. I didn't know exactly how to bring up every conversation. And I felt very uncomfortable during a lot of the dialogue that I had with people, or seeing some of their emotion in ways that I hadn't seen it before, feeling like I had hit a button that hadn't been pressed in decades in some cases. So it was very uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't lean into it and make those untalkable things more talkable.
It sounds like you experienced surprises along the way, things that you didn't anticipate. Is that right?
Yes, there were definitely some things where you feel like you kind of know the people in your life, and then you dig in and you ask some of these questions. And my grandpa in particular, in the chapter, focused on kind of the dynamics of my dad's family, from my great grandpa to my dad and to my brother. There were definitely things I learned about my great uncle's death that I wasn't aware of. There were things about my mom that I learned that I wasn't aware of. And I thought I had a pretty good read, because I've always been pretty inquisitive and I've asked intrusive questions, for better or for worse, throughout my life. So, I mean, it wasn't totally new that I was asking certain things, but I definitely learned a lot. And again, I think that's such a big takeaway from the book, because when you learn certain things about people in your life who are impactful, it can allow you to, and that doesn't mean you're making excuses for them or excusing their behavior if they've wronged you in some way, but it does help put things together in a way that allows you to make sense of it and cope more effectively.
I was wondering how your relationships are now with the people you talk to. Did anything feel like it changed after you had these deep conversations?
Yes and no. I think I've had some family members and friends reach out almost apologetically, right? Saying, wow, I'm sorry, because believe it or not, the book would tell you otherwise, but I'm actually quite a reserved and private person. I don't share too much about myself. I never really have. And so speaking to people who know me after reading the book, it has changed the dynamics because I've gotten a lot of feedback about like, wow, I guess I didn't know you all that well. And I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions, or there's a lot of apologies that I think are misplaced and not always necessary, but I appreciate it. And so I do think it has opened more opportunity to have deeper, more meaningful connections, which I think is another big intention for the book, is asking readers to turn the narratives that I present, turn it into their own life, right? How can they deepen their relationships? What issues do they still have unresolved? How are they dealing with grief and loss in a way that might not be serving them? And what can they do different to feel more connection while they are still alive?
That's so wonderful. One of the things I was thinking about as I was reading it is how can I use this with my story and my family? Because I'm at a point, I was born late to my parents. They were much older parents than most people had. And all their brothers and sisters most of them were older than they were. And so most of my family's gone. And the cousins, although there were lots of cousins, actually a lot of them are gone. And the ones that aren't gone physically have moved so far away and lost touch with no access to addresses or things like that. I'm not even sure some of them are alive because I haven't heard from them for so long. And it's odd to me because it kind of a big family growing up. I was one of the babies in the family. I had a couple of other younger cousins, but most of the cousins were my sister's age and older, and she was 9 years older than I was. So I have found that while my parents' generation was still around, that we always did things together and visited each other and did that sort of thing. And then after all of the parents' generation passed, we just kind of aren't connected anymore. That just amazes me. I know when we had the fire in Lahaina here last August, that it was incredibly traumatic to the island. And I had one cousin reach out of all the people that I knew to see if I was okay. He's somebody that I rarely get a chance to talk to. He's not a talker. When he was in the military and I lived in San Diego, he would come up when he had a weekend off to stay with me. So, because he was not real social with other people, and we could sit and play games for hours, but he never talked. So we had no conversations. And I think it would be really interesting to know his story, because his story certainly takes a different path than the rest of the family, but he doesn't talk. So I don't know if at this point I could say, hey, tell me this stuff before you can't.
Yes. Oh my gosh, absolutely. And there's so much curiosity in that too, right? Like, why doesn't he talk? And has that served him? And is that still serving him? And is that serving you or the rest of your family? And that reminds me a bit, I think my grandpa on my dad's side, my grandpa Teddy, who it sounds like you are familiar with now, I think he was one who, when I would ask questions, oftentimes his first response was, I don't remember, or I don't know, or I don't know that I really have much to say there. And he was one of the only ones that both my grandparents were in the house together. And my grandma said she was going to be in a separate room, and she was, but she was totally listening because she'd kind of yell things out like, you know that, or, whatever. So that was kind of interesting too, is sometimes it took a little nudge from her to get him to be like, oh, okay, right, yes, and to engage in the process a little bit more. But yeah, there's so much curiosity for those people who just kind of have question marks. You're not entirely sure. And yeah, I think that is a huge message from the book, is while they are still around, ask.
Yeah, it's so important. I've had two husbands die, and the first one who died was a whole lot older than I was. And he had the experience of growing up in Los Angeles, where all of his family, quite a bit of family, were all involved in the movie industry when it was first being an industry. And his mom got up to the position of executive secretary to some of the big people there. A couple, she served for two different ones at different times. And one of them, and I wish I could tell you his name, but he was an art director. He designed the Academy Award, actually. She was working for him at the time, and she came in one day and he goes, "Here, let me show you this." And he showed her this picture that he had drawn on a napkin when he was out to dinner with people the night before. And they were talking about what the award looked like. And so he said, "I drew this. What do you think? Is this cool?" So that was really neat. But I had heard that story. But she had this picture that was hanging in her bedroom, and she was Catholic, and it was a drawing of a nun in a white habit who kind of had her arms out to the side and reached out but low down and kind of looking up. Beautiful, beautiful picture. And she had all this white on, so it was colored in the back, black. It was all done in pencil. It was a really amazing picture, but I thought it had something to do with her religion. I didn't know where she got it or anything. And after she died and I was helping my husband clear out her house, I said, "Where'd she get this?" And so he told me the story about how her boss, the same one who designed the Academy Award, was an art director. And the story was that he never put anything on paper. He would just tell people what it was supposed to look like. And he was the person who in Hollywood, in the early movies, they were very, very artificial. Everything was artificial in the background, and he changed things over to realism, which hadn't been done before. So it was a really big deal. But they were doing this one movie called Women in White, and or Woman in White, haven't been able to find a copy of it because I would just love to see it. But he was having a really hard time expressing to the people he was working with what he wanted it to look like. And so he had it was a piece of, like a big piece of newsprint, and he just drew this. And they said, "Oh, okay, we got it." And they went out, and he was so happy about it. And my mother-in-law came in and she saw the picture, and she said, "Oh, that's a gorgeous picture." And he said, "Oh, I was just getting ready to throw it away. It's just on newsprint. Do you want it?" And she said, "Yes." Cedric Gibbons. I can't believe I remembered his name out of the blue. So that was that picture that was hanging there all that time. And my husband had lots of friends in the movie industry too. And one of them was somebody he went to college with and then had gone on to New York and done everything on Broadway. But he'd come back to California, and they happened to get in touch after they hadn't talked to each other for 20, 30 years. And I was telling him about that picture because I thought he'd be interested. So he was. And then he went home. He lived far away from us. He had just been visiting. And we got this copy of Architectural Digest that was a special on MGM where she worked. And in it, there was a story about Cedric Gibbons. And in the story, it said he never put pen to paper, or he never drew anything for anybody to see. He just told them how to do it. And I thought, I've got the evidence that that's not true.
Yes. Oh my goodness. How cool is that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if she would have told me about it before she died. I'm not sure if the whole sequence of events would have turned out the way they did, but it was so random because this friend Jacques hadn't talked to in so many years, and for them to get reconnected and then to be able to relate to that, it was amazing. So when you start to talk to somebody, it's amazing what could come out. And I think it's important to write those things down so that maybe somebody will read it sometime and go, "Oh, I didn't know that."
Yes, it can just make a lot of connections that I do think can really aid with sense making and the ability to make sense of our experiences. And, there are some things that we truly can't make sense of, and we can't solve every problem, and, right, we can't fix everything that's broken. But I think sense making is just such an important variable that is at our disposal and that we work through in the various layers of not just grief and loss, but all kinds of aspects of our life.
It really does. You just reminded me of another experience that I had. I was a theater major as an undergrad, and I got the opportunity to be in a show that was part of the National Endowment for the Humanities that had given a grant to our university to do a study on the Okie migration, because we were in California where the Okies migrated to during the Dust Bowl when all that was going on. They, in the project, interviewed tons of people about their experiences of what they experienced in the process of that. And our director in the theater department took all of those interviews and created a script out of it that was just a series of people talking. And so he cast a group of people, and we got together and put together how it was going to flow and what was going to happen. And it was amazing. I was like the lead. I had more speeches than anybody else. And every time we'd talk, we were representing somebody different. So we had to change from each speech from one thing to another. And the stories were phenomenal. And when we put it on, we sold out every night and had people in aisles and in the lobby because they wanted to be part of it. And we did it in winter quarter. In the next fall, we built the sets again and everything and did it over again because so many people related to it and wanted to see it and hadn't been able to see it the first time. It was really a big thing. Well, my dad was a Dust Bowl immigrant. He was an Okie, and he lived in Oklahoma, and his mom had died when he was really young. So his dad put him and his two much older sisters in this junky vehicle they got with everything tied on top and drove out to California in 1929. And my dad used to say he wasn't an Okie because the Okies came in the 30s and he came out in 1929. So, which I thought was fun. And that's all he ever said about it. He didn't tell about the experience of coming out or anything about that at all until he came to see the show. And people were crying. It was a deep, deep experience. And I know it really touched him. And our relationship totally changed after I did that show. It was so important to him that he could see that I respected what he went through and the value of what he went through.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that reminds me too. And that's been something that's been reflected in some of my conversations with family members since the book came out, but a sense of gratitude in, it was very difficult for them to open up and to get into some of the stories and some of the details that I was asking them about. There was also a sense of catharsis and a sense of opening up the door for them to continue to do some of their own work, right? Process through some of their own experiences and deal with some of the things that they hadn't dealt with. And so I do think there has been some gratitude, even though the initial pain, and the rust that they kind of had to shake off was more prominent initially. Over time, I think we've seen some of that relief and some of the changes in which they've made for themselves, right? Things they've wanted to talk about or think about or just put a little bit more energy and effort into as a result, which has been quite cool to see. Now, at the same time, some people haven't changed at all. And some people will probably never talk about some of the things that I asked again. And that's okay too, right? That isn't necessarily my intention to be my family's therapist. That's unethical in all sorts of ways. So I don't want to cross that line, but it's been quite cool to see the different ways that people have responded and will continue to respond as time goes on.
Yeah, I mentioned that the children of the people that are in the book would be really grateful for having that book and being able to pass it on to their children and say, this is my family. This is what happened.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I've already had the experience of, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, but when my great grandma died, the dynamics of our family changed so much. And then when kind of the matriarch for her stepped in, her oldest daughter, my Aunt Dora, when she died, even more so, we saw changes to the family. And so the generation that has come after me, they don't have the same upbringing that I had. They don't know my aunts and uncles in the same way. And so that's been kind of cool to have a distant cousin recently reach out to me who read it and again said thank you. I don't remember Aunt Dora and I don't remember Grandma Claire, and hearing how the family used to be and learning about some of those people was really cool and really helpful for them. So I think that's been something. Yeah, we have a tangible history to a certain extent for certain people and certain events in our lives, which we can hang on to forever.
It's so beautiful. Your book is just so beautifully written. The detail is amazing. I really was feeling connection to all the people as I was going through with that, because it was really kind of hard to describe, besides saying that it's so real. And it was inspirational to me, because I just thought I have to write some of this stuff down before nobody will know what happened.
Yes. And again, that's been one of my biggest takeaways is I want people, after you read the book, I want you talking and thinking less about the narratives I've told and the people in my life, but really reflecting on yours, right? And really kind of thinking through, yes, why am I the way I am? What about the other people in my life? I don't have ample time, right? Our time is limited on this earth. So what do I want to do with it? What's still unresolved? What do I want to document? What questions do I want to ask? What do I need to sift through to try to make my life a bit more meaningful with what I have left? And that's one of the coolest things to hear, is when someone starts talking about the book, but then I get to hear these stories, right? I get to hear about your dad and your husband and some of those. It's exactly what I want. That's exactly why I wrote it.
That's wonderful. I was just going to ask you why you wrote it, and now you answered that question before I could ask it. So
yeah, absolutely. I don't know that was my initial intention though either, right? I truly started writing the book because I had two of the most, up to this point in my life, the two most significant losses of my life were pretty close together. And I think there was a lot of shame for me. I'm a psychologist and I specialize in grief, and I shouldn't be struggling. I should know exactly what to do and what to say. And all the things I tell people are BS, frankly, I was really struggling with, right? I was telling myself, oh, I'm still struggling with this, or why can't I move on from this? Or gosh, it just was not a good time. And so I initially started writing the book because I was like, I gotta sort this out for myself. And frankly, I just need something to keep me busy. I need something to be focused with and help me process and keep me busy. And so that's how it really started. And then over time, it was like, oh, wait, there's some more purposes to this.
that's so beautiful. I always encourage people to write about grief. I host a gathering on Zoom every week for people who would like to write together about grief. And they love that because I give them a prompt that just comes to me, and they write about that. And then they go into breakout rooms. So there's just like 3 people in each of the breakout rooms. So they really have a chance to talk to each other. It's not like in a big group. Then they come back together and share something they learned in the process that time. And then we always learn a happiness practice too, because that's what I do. They got to have happiness along with what they're doing. But they love the connection with people who are also dealing with loss, who get them, because so many times they feel like they don't have anybody to talk to and nobody understands. And when they get together and they write about these things that are really significant to them, and then get to share it with somebody and to listen to somebody else's story. At the end of the group, every week, everyone's smiling. There might have been some tears in the process of the group, but they're all smiling at the end, and they're all expressing their gratitude for, this is so wonderful. I'm so glad we came and we were able to do this together. And I have new friends today, and that sort of thing. And it's just beautiful. I just think the value of writing to deal with grief is a little untapped. And if I can help people along the way with that, and it's not, they don't have to write books. It's just the process of the expression that they can get by writing and remembering things when you're writing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Externalizing it. You also speak to something that I think is so powerful and a huge message in a lot of different ways throughout the book, which is just this idea of the both and instead of either or, right? So you're getting this group together to talk about grief, which is painful and sorrowful and hard. And yet at the end, there is connection, there is smiling, there is togetherness, there is no isolation, no more loneliness, at least for that moment. And so it just draws me to this both and that I think is such an important message and something I really try to infuse into each chapter, regardless of the life event, whether it's a desirable one or an undesirable one. We experience both gains and losses. You can't exist in one sphere without having felt the other either. And that's just one of the most, I guess, complicated, but also universal and real things about life, is that both and. And so I think helping people recognize that and try to live more in the gray and find that duality and really embrace it is a huge message that I want to send readers and people grieving all over. It typically isn't an either or. There's not an end point, or there's not a direct how to, this is how you do things. It's very messy, but the both and is often there.
Well, I have absolutely loved this conversation, and I know that people who are listening are going to have to get your book. It's, how can I put it? It's kind of an intense read because it's long, but the detail is fabulous. You get so much out of each different chapter. Each chapter is a whole different story, but they all connect together, and it's just a beautiful thing, and it'll be inspirational to you for writing your own stories too, which I think is one of the most valuable things you can do to help you deal with your grief.
Yeah, and again, I tried to do that quite intentionally too, is to have each chapter be focused on a different type of loss, because oftentimes people think, oh, well, I'm not grieving because no one's died. But anytime you experience a significant loss, you grieve. There's a grief process. So I think that was also something really important to bring to light. There's a chapter on athletics. There's a chapter on perfectionism. There's a chapter on losing a first love. There's things that we grieve that are incredibly impactful that are not just death.
Yes. Well, we'll have all your links so people can get your book and learn more about you if they want to. We'll put that in the show notes for people to use. And I am just so grateful you came today. I'm grateful that I was able to read that book because it's so good.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so, so much. I'm humbled, and what a compliment. I'm so glad that it spoke to you. And yeah, thank you for having me on. This time together has been great.
Oh, thank you. Okay, to my listeners, I'll see you again next week. Be sure to check those show notes so that you can have access to what we were talking about. And spend some time reading and writing this week. You'll get a lot out of both things to really help you with your grief and help you find some happiness along the way. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next week. Do you want more comfort and support and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance at our free gatherings on Zoom every Sunday. Visit my website at griefandhappiness.com and read my books, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and get your set of the beautiful Grief and Happiness cards. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge listen to all of our episodes. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode of the Grief and Happiness Podcast.